How many people have used InfoPath before? Okay, quite a few. And how many of you would consider yourselves, or how many of you have done sort of any development in InfoPath of any kind? And by that I mean sort of coding. Yeah. Okay, so rest of you, I'm assuming, have used sort of no-code solutions. That's good. All right. Okay. I'm guessing we might as well make a start. First of all, Darvish. Those of you who know Darvish may know that I'm not Darvish. I'm covering his session. He's one of the 20 people that were unfortunately unable to make it across the Atlantic. So I'm going to be covering for him and introducing not just InfoPath, but more specifically how we can actually use InfoPath to build SharePoint applications. So there's a number of things that we can do now, such as customizing the list forms and that you'll find inside document libraries and also SharePoint lists. We'll also take a look at some of the web parts that are available to us, including the form web part, which will quite easily allow you to set up an InfoPath form on a page. And I'm going to show you some of the sort of web part connections, joining that to a SharePoint list and so on. A little bit about myself. My name is Brett Lonsdale. I work for a company called Lightning Tools, which is based here in the UK, down in Reading. You can see our website address on there, lightningtools.com, and my email address should you have any questions or anything after the session. I'm primarily a specialist in the business data catalog and now business connectivity services. I've authored a book along with my business partner Nick Swan on the business data catalog. That's the developer's guide to the business data catalog. I also contributed to a couple of other books for Bill English and Todd Bleeker as well. So the Administrator's Companion, 2007. I'm just about finished my 2010 chapter as well for web parts, although I've got some great ideas from this session and decided to probably see if I can actually make that chapter a little bit longer. I have already submitted it, but hopefully I'll be able to get it back before it goes to press and get that done. Also, I wrote a little bit of the Developer's Guide to WSS version 3. There is a new book coming out, by the way, for SharePoint Foundations, which is written by Paul Schaeflein and Todd Bleeker. So if you enjoyed the Developer's Guide to WSS version 3, then you should certainly keep an eye out for the new version of that. Anybody here listen to the SharePoint Pod Show as well? A couple of you? Okay, so it might be something that you might want to listen to. There's myself, Nick Swan, and also Rob Foster. We together host the SharePoint Pod Show. At events like these, we try and grab some people and talk about SharePoint. If they're a specialist in a particular subject, we'll interview them and record that, and we tend to make available sort of bi-weekly episodes, although some people will disagree and say that it's more like a month that you have to wait. But there are some, about 43 episodes so far that you can go and download and learn about SharePoint that way. Okay, so I inherited this slide deck, and here's a picture of a hand amongst a number of forms. So I'm guessing the message here is the fact that we used to fill out forms by hand, which I actually don't find too difficult. What I find more difficult is trying to fill out forms that are attached to emails and sent to us in the form of Word documents or Excel spreadsheets even, and you try to fill this thing out and you mess up the formatting, or you can't quite key in the number of values that you need to fill in a tiny little space and so on. So InfoPath is a fantastic tool allowing us to get around that problem. It was introduced with Microsoft Office 2003. Did anybody use it back then? Okay, one or two. So if you got the very early version of InfoPath 2003, you probably would have been very disappointed. There was a lot of things that couldn't really be done, including things like calculations on dates. I can remember one of the first tasks that I was given was to go and create a expenses form, and all I wanted to do was do some sort of calculation on a start date and an end date. And find out how many days are in between, and that seemed almost impossible without writing a whole load of code. So there were some issues with that, mainly because of the way that it stored its data inside an XML form, and you needed to manipulate it with XPath and so on. But there was a service pack out, Service Pack 1, not long after that, and that made the product a lot better. But it still had one underlying issue, and that was to actually complete an InfoPath form, you needed to have InfoPath. And that kind of made it difficult to use. It sounds strange. I mean, obviously, if you want to use an Excel spreadsheet, then you need to have Excel, of course, and so on. But not everybody had a copy of InfoPath, so you could design a form, and then not everybody could fill it out. That was the issue. So with SharePoint 2007, or with MOS, I should say, you did then have Form Services, which made that life, or that story a little bit better. It meant that we could actually use Form Services, store an InfoPath form inside a form library, and then you could complete that using the browser. The good news is that story's got even better today. There's actually not just an InfoPath designer application, but we also have an InfoPath filler now as well. So it's if you're not actually interested in designing InfoPath forms, then you can just get the filler application and complete the form that way, or you can still use Form Services within SharePoint. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to what InfoPath is and what it allows us to do. That's going to be kept very brief, because we're going to spend most of the time this afternoon with some demonstrations. There's 3 demonstrations. The first 2 of them I can do exactly as Darvish intended them to be delivered. The last one did rely upon a Microsoft solution. Darvish works with Microsoft, and this was actually a solution that they built for a customer. So I can't get my hands on that, but I can talk all the way through it and explain exactly what it did. And that will hopefully give you lots of food for thought. So yeah, after our introduction, we're going to talk about how we can use InfoPath within SharePoint to customize SharePoint list forms. That gives us plenty of power within SharePoint and takes away some of the effort that developers had to provide within a SharePoint environment, allowing power users and information workers to easily create solutions, add validation, and so on to those lists. We're then going to take a look at the InfoPath form web part and create a mashup of web parts on a page. So we're going to have some SharePoint lists that contain InfoPath forms, and we're going to join that to the InfoPath form web part, so you can easily just navigate to a page and fill out a form and collect data, or you can modify existing data from a list using the form. And then, like I say, finally, we'll talk about Office Business Applications, OBA, and how InfoPath is almost the center of Office Business Applications, since it's widely used throughout Microsoft Office now. Bless you. Okay, so what is InfoPath? Well, like I said, we've now got a form designer and we've got a form filler. So we can easily create forms without having to write code. In the past, we may have used, like I said, another Office application such as Excel or Word, in which you're going to come across limitations very easily. Or you perhaps developed a form, got your developers to write a form using ASP or ASP.NET or something, and completed forms that way. So the nice thing about InfoPath is we've got a number of controls that we can simply drag and drop onto a form. It provides us an easy way to create layouts using tables and so on. We can create different views for that form. And obviously we've got things like rules, conditions, and workflow and things like that that we can build into the application as well. So these are the 3 things that really form an InfoPath form. We've got a visual layout, so you can design the form using the controls, as I mentioned, make it look pleasing. You've also got logic that you can build into the form. Logic can be built into the form using rules, and rules are vastly improved over how they were in the previous version in 2007. We can also put form logic in there using code if we want to. And that's been improved as well. The number of languages that you can actually develop with has been extended. Once upon a time, it was simply just JavaScript or some Visual Basic, which we've kind of moved along from Visual Basic now, and people are writing C# code, so you can put some C# in there if you want to. And then finally, we've got data connections. So the information that we're putting into a form doesn't always have to come from the user. We can actually go and get data from relational databases. We can go after them directly. We can get information from SharePoint lists, using BCS even, Business Connectivity Services, web services, whatever you want to do, pretty much. You can extract some data, bring it into your form to make people, or empower people to be able to select data that way. And we can also submit data to back-end databases or web services as well, using that service. Okay. So, like I said, we've got the form designer and filler, allowing you to browse forms and also design forms. We've also got forms for SharePoint as well. So throughout SharePoint, InfoPath is now usable. SharePoint lists have a number of forms in them for displaying views of data, allowing us to edit data and create data and so on. There's a new interface to that. So using InfoPath and the ribbon, we can very easily modify those forms to provide things like conditional formatting and additional logic. That's great for things like validation that you may want to perform before submitting data. There's a new type of list in SharePoint 2010 as well. Even in Foundation services, you get external lists. So that's used with Business Connectivity Services. Once upon a time, the BDC used to be read-only. So you had a number of web parts that would just simply display data to you. Now we have this new thing called an external list. So if you use SharePoint Designer to create a connection to a database using an external content type, you can not only read data within an external list that's coming from your backend system, but you can insert new data and edit that data and so on. Now, one of the you could develop your own custom web part within the BDC to do that, but obviously if you've got validation logic going on in the backend database, you'd have to write that same validation code within your custom web part before submitting it. However, with the external list, again, you can take those forms directly into to InfoPath and customize it that way. So a fantastic way to provide logic. You've still got form libraries. They still exist. So you can publish forms to form libraries, and then that way you can utilize them if people don't have the InfoPath client. And SharePoint Workflow also uses InfoPath forms. So these are widely used through SharePoint Designer, and you can now go and modify those forms that are part of your workflow in InfoPath. Forms are also integrated into the rest of Office. How many people have seen SharePoint Workspace? Quite a few of you. Okay, so SharePoint Workspace is fantastic. One of the main gripes about, or trying to convince users to use SharePoint, I stole this from this morning. We did a SharePoint Pod Show interview with two guys here. So they said one of the main gripes from their users is the fact that people don't want to store documents inside document libraries because if they're away from the office or whatever, they can't get to their content, they can't get to their documents. So you can now with SharePoint Workspace. And the forms, when you take that list information or library information offline, the forms that are used to edit properties and so on with those documents are still using the InfoPath form. So any customizations that you make are also carried across to SharePoint Workspace as well. Outlook, Word, PowerPoint, and Excel also make use of InfoPath forms for certain things. Okay, so that was our sort of brief introduction to InfoPath. We're going to talk about, we're going to demonstrate customizing SharePoint list forms now. So you'll be able to see how to simply take a couple of custom lists and make some changes to those. Now this is apparently a real-world application that's used at Microsoft that we're going to be looking into. So what they have is a number of interviewers who go along to universities, I guess, throughout the world, and they interview people for potential jobs at Microsoft. And they'll get an email such as this, inviting them to be recruited. So what you can do if you receive one of these emails is there's a couple of links within the page that take you directly to a SharePoint site containing a couple of SharePoint lists. There's a recruiting list, and there's also a school list. So the recruiting list will show when there's going to be an interviewer at the school, so you can sign up to be interviewed. And there's also a school list so you can see if your school's on there and so on. It contains all the address details and whatnot. Okay, so yeah, you can see those links there, and you can see a snapshot of the list at the bottom right. But what we're going to do is customize those forms to add a little bit of business logic to the lists that are utilized there. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to jump into well, let me just show you the schools and universities. It's a very, very straightforward list. It's just created using a custom list, and you can see in there it's got a school name, it's got an address, a city, state, and zip as well. And I'm going to nip across to the recruiting trips, which this just shows us, a couple of trips to Leicestershire or Yorkshire, and a US trip, and who the interviewer is, and we've got the date, the number of days that the interviewer is going to be there. And we've got a discipline, so we're going to be recruiting people for development testing, and the other one was program management. Okay. So what you'll notice is when we go to read one of these items, if I just click onto one of those, this is the new kind of form that we've been talking about. So this is our way of viewing data within SharePoint. And that is the form that we're going to be customizing. I can go and edit that item if I want to, and you'll see some pretty standard controls, drop-down lists, and so on and so forth. So what we want to do is customize this, like I said, to add a little bit of business logic to it. So in order to do that, you'll notice when I go into the list, I've got the list ribbon, and over on the right-hand side is a Customize Form option on the ribbon button. So we're just going to simply click that, and you'll notice the form opens up straight away and is available in InfoPath for me to start customizing it. So we're going to do sort of three phases of changes here. One of them is going to make it look slightly better, show you some of the sort of things that you can do there, because you may not like the grey and everything that's used. You may have gone and applied a custom theme or something within SharePoint. So I'll show you how you can go and utilize the same themes that you use within SharePoint inside these forms. So the first thing I'm going to do is just make the title look a little bit better. So I'm going to move the title up to the top here. And we're going to style that using the title style. And I'm also going to go and get rid of, if I can see the right ribbon, I'm going to go and delete this row where the title was. And I'm also going to delete the row where the attachments is as well. I'm not going to be making any attachments to that. Okay, so I've got a bigger title along the top here, and Darvish also thought it'd be nice to add a little picture. So I couldn't use the same picture that he used, but I went and found a little school picture here, which will drop in the top right-hand corner of our page. There we go. Okay, so the idea is that we start to attempt to improve the look and feel. What I'm also going to do is show you how you can get those themes that I was talking about. So here's a number of themes that we have available, so we can pick and choose one of those and apply a bit of color to our forms. And that's it. We're pretty much ready for testing. I'm going to do a lot more with this form. This is just phase one. So you'll notice that I can either preview that if I don't want to publish the changes yet, or I can use this quick publish option, which straight away just writes that back to the SharePoint list within SharePoint. Okay, so it said it's been published successfully. I'm going to go back into SharePoint now, and you'll notice if I click onto one of these strips that we've got the new form. It's as simple as that. All right, so some nice yellow, a nice little image, and we've got the title stands out so people can actually read it now. And that's the same for the edit form. So if I click onto edit form, you can see the same style as used throughout. Okay. All right, so the next thing we're going to do, I've left InfoPath open. The next thing we're going to do is go and create a new field so we can do a little bit of validation. Now, because we're using the same form to read data that we're using to edit the data, it's possible that once we've actually created one of these recruitment trips, that somebody could click the drop down here and change accidentally the recruiting discipline. So what we're going to do is just add that field twice and allow people to sort of validate it, so they'd have to be wrong twice and not wrong once. So what I'm going to do is just insert a new row, which is actually done from here. And I'm going to go and create a new field. And it was called Interviewer Discipline. Just another slight tweak here in InfoPath 2010. When I was designing forms, it took me a while to actually get used to not putting a space in the name, and then you had to go and change the label all the time. Now you can actually put a space in the display name and it works out and strips out those spaces for you. I know that's very, very easy to do, but it was a frustrating thing back in the day. Okay, so I've got my interviewer discipline field, and I can simply drag that, drop it onto the form, and we'll tidy it up a little bit, move my label across. And I should have actually made that a choice. So let's just go in and make that a choice instead. Probably can't now. Let's delete it. Okay, so I'll edit my choices. And we're going to have testing, development, and program manager. Okay, now I'll drag it and drop it into the form. Okay, so almost exactly the same field that we've already got. Now to add the validation, we're going to add a rule. So what I can do is simply select my new field, and we've got along the top here somewhere the ability to add a rule. So notice there I can choose the is not equal to rule, and I'm going to show a validation error if it's not equal. So I'm going to choose my interviewer discipline and compare that to the recruiting discipline. So I can browse out, insert a field. There's the recruiting discipline field. So I'll just simply select that, choose OK. And we get to give that a name. Which I'll call it discipline rule. Okay, and we can just simply preview that rather than publishing it back straight away. So if I happen to have two different disciplines now, you'll see that error. It's basically just highlighting the box in red, and obviously if the two match, then that error goes away. So we've just got a simple bit of validation there on the form. So that's one of the changes. Whilst we're here in InfoPath, we'll go and do phase 3. What I'd like to do this time is actually go and add a data connection through to the other list. So you'll notice at the very bottom here, I've just got my colleges text box, but all the schools and colleges live in a different SharePoint list. So what I'd like to do is actually be able to see those on the page, allowing me to select one. So we've got a question. Very good question. It's not created the column. no. But it will appear on the form when I go to complete it. Yeah.
On the right-hand side, one of those that control pieces will change. So does that mean you can't do sort of out-of-context bindings anymore? That structure's changed, isn't it?
Oh, there's an advanced view here. What we've got now is the basic view, which is obviously a bit more pleasing to the eye for most InfoPath designers. But yeah, you can certainly switch across to the advanced view, and you see almost what you did in 2007. So yeah, you can change all the bindings and whatnot. Okay, you'll be seeing that in just a moment when we create the data connection. All right, so there's an option right at the very bottom right here, for those of you that can't see, manage data connections, and I'm going to go and add a new data connection. So we can choose between two options. Do we want to receive data or do we want to submit data? So in this example, I'm going to receive some data. And these are the different places where we can receive data from. So we've got SOAP web services, REST web services, SharePoint lists and libraries, databases, and XML documents. Okay, so quite a few locations there. I'm going to go for the SharePoint library or list. It already knows what site I'm in, the MS Recruiting site. That's not because I practiced this earlier. That was because I'm in this site. And then we've got our lists. So there's the schools and universities list. I'm going to select that and then pick and choose which columns I want to display. So I'm going to take the school name, the address, city, state, and zip. Okay. So we've now got our new data connection created. So in order to see the data connection, notice the good question from the front here was we can't see what we used to see on the list of fields. So I have to switch across to the advanced view. And that allows me to pick between the two connections that I've got within this InfoPath form. I've got the main connection, which contains all of my fields on the form, back from the SharePoint list. And I've also got my schools and universities list as the second option. So it must be a secondary school. There we go. All right. So here's my list of fields. See there, I've got all the fields coming from the second list. And what I'm going to do is simply right-click onto that and say I want to create a repeating section, because there's more than one of them. So I'll create the repeating section. And that's created that repeating section exactly where I didn't want it on the page. So I'm just going to come back up here, right-click and say I want a repeating section again. That's better. Okay, so I've got a repeating section, so it's going to repeat every single column for every single row that I have within that list. And so that this form doesn't look messy, I'm also going to go and insert a table. So I can pick and choose one of these tables from the ribbon. And I can give this a heading and a subheading. Let's just go with the subheading. So I'll call that schools and universities. And the address might be quite large, so I'm going to merge two top cells here. And then I can start dropping this information on the page. So I'll pop the address in. I should perhaps have the school name in there as well. Oops. And drop the city in. State and zip. Something went wrong there. Let's try and add that one again. There we go. Okay, so we've got city, state, and zip. And now I'm just going to do a quick preview so we can see how that looks. So you can see that at the moment on the form we are able to see the content coming from the other list, but we're seeing the repeating section for every single one, which is not what we want to see. What we'd ideally want to see is just the address for the college that we select. Okay? So we're going to do a couple of things here. The first thing I'm going to do is add another rule so that we actually hide the repeating section if this isn't filled out at all. So unless you actually choose a college, you won't see anything. And then we're going to go and add an OR statement so that we can show the correct schools or university for the one that we chose. So I'm going to close the preview, select the repeating section. Okay, so that becomes highlighted, and I'm able to choose the drop down here, go to rules, and create another new rule. And this time we're going to do some formatting. So I'll give it a name, which is going to hide the repeating section. And give it a condition. So notice here that all I can see is the information coming from the repeating section itself, because I'm inside that control. But if I go down to select a field or group, I can change the connection again. So I'm going to go back to main, go and grab my colleges field, and we're just going to say if that is blank, then we want to hide the entire control. Okay. So we're done with that, and again we can preview the form. So this time we're not actually seeing anything, but if I go and put in a value of any kind, then we get all the schools and universities again. So we're halfway there. The last thing I want to do, select this again, and I should be able to jump back into my rule manager here, and that brings up the last rule. And I can go in and click onto the condition, and we're going to put an OR statement in there. Okay, so we're going to say OR. If I remember rightly. I'm going to match the IDs. Did anybody happen to notice which ID I just grabbed? I think it was that one. I'll just check that. I should be comparing the school ID. The main one. I think we're good. Okay. So I'll preview that once more. And hopefully if I enter the value 1, we get to see all of them. So it didn't quite work. I could have got away with that if I didn't scroll down, couldn't I? Let's just delete this guy. Maybe I need an is equal to, I don't know. Oh, thank you. Let's just try that one more time. See, it worked. Okay, you get the idea. Some logic in there that I'm missing. Okay. All right, so there's my form. And we can publish that back. So now when I go and open up a recruiting trip, and I'll edit this item here, we should be able to put in a value and see the relevant school and university. Okay, so that's really demo 1. It's a very good question, and I'm not sure I've tried that, or if I have, I can't remember it. So let's go and just give that a go. It'll only take a moment. So the question was, if I go and add a new column. In fact, one thing I did note, it did actually add the column in. I just noticed that there. So let's just call this ABC. And I'm wondering if I just refresh this. Where do I refresh? Okay, well, let's just close that down and we'll open it again. So it's actually telling me that one of the fields has changed in there, so I can go and update the data source. So I have the option.
Right. It's just one form that is actually being rendered and then it display on you.
Yes, correct.
So if you wanted to have differences in what is displayed, would you need to put that use rules InfoPath to do that?
Yeah. You would manage the rules for each sort of state,
you
if you like.
detect whether it's and then it display on you.
Yeah.
And then
But I mean, obviously, for things like validation, they can't change anything when they're just reading it anyway.
But it's possible that you may want not to have everything on a display form that you have on a new form, for example, or an edit form or something like that.
Yeah. So again, you could create different views in InfoPath and get around it that way.
Once you've suitably broken the out-of-the-box form, can you just press a button and go back to the out-of-the-box?
Yeah, you can pull that out. It's basically stored within the list itself, inside the forms, just as it was before. So yeah, you can simply just revert back to how it was by getting rid of that customization. Okay, I'll see if I can show you that at the end if you want to come up. All right. Okay, so that was customizing SharePoint list forms. So in the past, in order to do that, it did get very messy. It was very difficult to do. I don't know if anybody tried doing it in SharePoint Designer, but you had to do a lot of messing around. And obviously, to do some of the things that we did just there, you'd need to write some code. So this allows information workers to try and solve some of their own problems, and they've got the best understanding of the business logic that they require. You can obviously use layout forms, use the rules as we did to do some conditional formatting. You can bring in the data from other SharePoint lists. One thing I didn't show you there was actually taking that form or that list offline with SharePoint Workspace and how the form carries through. So let's just jump back into my list again. And you'll notice here on the ribbon is the Sync to SharePoint Workspace option. So I'm in the recruiting trips list still. Click on OK to that. That goes and syncs the list down. And I can now go and open up my workspace. And there's there's my 3 recruiting trips, and here's my my form down at the bottom there. So so that comes through as well. Yeah. The SharePoint Workspace, the whole idea is to actually be able to take the data offline. So if I was disconnected from the internet, I can still work with my content and so on.
Multi-users, I mean, someone else can edit the content that is...
Yeah, if they were connected to the SharePoint environment, and then it has a conflict resolution and merges it. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. All right, so that was demonstration 1, customizing the SharePoint list forms. What we're going to do now is take a look at how we can create mashups with the form web part. So the idea here being that on the recruiting page, I'm going to get rid of some of the stuff that you can see already on this page. And we're going to insert a couple of web parts, one of them being the list view web part, and the other one being the InfoPath form web part. So we'll get rid of this as well. It gives a bit more space to work. Okay, so here in the left-hand web part zone, I'm going to choose Insert, go to Web Part, and from the lists and libraries, I'm going to obtain my recruiting trips, and we'll add that. And just beneath recruiting trips, we're going to go and add this new web part. So under Forms, you'll notice that there's an InfoPath form web part. So we can add the two web parts on the page there. Now, it's possible to open up the tool pane for the InfoPath form web part, and you'll notice that through this, I can select a list or a library, and it'll go and obtain the forms that are available within that list and library, and I can then display them on the page and obviously use that to complete the form. And there's numerous options in here, so we can specify which content type we want to use if you had multiple content types. You can also make it a read-only form, not allowing people to submit data. You can show or hide the InfoPath form ribbon, and you can also select which view from the InfoPath form you want to display. And then the final option being, when you actually submit the form, you can either have it close or you can leave the form open, so you can carry on making changes to the item. So there's a number of options in there. I'm not going to actually select my form in that manner. I'm going to cancel out of the tool pane, and instead I'm going to use web part connections. So I'm going to first of all edit the InfoPath form web part, click the drop down again and go to connections, and notice that I can actually get the form using a web part connection. So I'm going to point it to recruiting trips. Okay, and that automatically goes and obtains the InfoPath form that's utilized for manipulating that list item data. So there's my Yorkshire trip, and the way that you fire a web part connection between web parts has changed. So we now have this little select icon, so I can choose things like the Leicestershire trip then, and it'll open up that form for me. So I'm not having to, you actually go and open up the form now and manipulate it within the browser or anything. I can just manipulate the data using that instead. So quite a big improvement. Okay, so that was just a small demonstration showing you how we can create mashups. Okay, so the mashups, they're created also by information workers and possibly IT. You can connect the web part to numerous web parts. It doesn't have to be just another list or library, so we can do things like filter out information from things like Excel Web Access web parts, or we can even connect it to a Silverlight web part and so on. Probably the biggest use is going to be a list. You can obviously customize that form within InfoPath if you need to. And they can also be packaged as WSPs. So deploying these forms across to your production environment is fairly straightforward as well. All right, so it's just a couple of things there. By the way, Darvish went a little bit further, just as a suggestion of something that you might want to do. In his example, he also created a hyperlink. You can't really read that, but it says map it. So just another couple of things that you could do with InfoPath there. That hyperlink is actually going to take the address details off the InfoPath form and then pass it to Bing Maps as a query parameter. So once you are displaying these schools and colleges, you can simply click onto that and display the location. You then had a REST web service. So REST allows you to get information out of a website, if you like. So if we want to return some data, and what he's doing here is once we've actually, again, got some address details in the form, he's actually going and obtaining the weather forecast for that area as well. So bringing back data that way. So there's just a couple of additional things that you could do for bringing data into the InfoPath form as well. All right, so finally there's demonstration 3. This is the one that I can't really show you because it is a real-world Office business application. Office business applications are difficult to describe because what is an Office business application? You're utilizing Microsoft Office to create an application. So there's just lots of different things that we can use now to create a very powerful Office business application. And the Business Data Catalog or Business Connectivity Services is amongst that. So if you want to create an Office application of some sort, then typically that might involve going and getting data from your back-end systems. So you could use Business Connectivity Services to connect to something like Microsoft CRM or whatever it might be, get the information into SharePoint, and you could argue at that point we're already creating part of an Office business app. But taking that into InfoPath becomes even more powerful. So we can actually even submit data back to that line of business system using a web service and write back to it. Or we can utilize the information in things like Word, Forms, and Excel as well using InfoPath. So what they had was basically an application. It was for an airline that Microsoft were involved in writing. And it allowed you to look up airline information and make a booking on a flight, and it was using an InfoPath form and data coming from a live line of business system. So it just showed you, it wasn't really showing you anything new, just the fact that here's a real world application, and it's one that is in use today. Okay. So OBAs, typically it's a business process owner. It does involve IT and also sometimes ISV, so it's not really something that information workers are going to be involved in creating, but they'll be using it. You can manage OBAs in SharePoint Designer. Literally, the whole of Office can get involved in creating an Office business application, but they're likely to use workflow and like I said, business connectivity services and also InfoPath. You may also involve a little bit of sandbox code as well and package the solution using a WSP. So, at that point, we've got some time left for some Q&A. So, this was the first time.
When you've got the listing modified before, can you create views on that form, or is that something that you can only do in real life?
As in a SharePoint list view.
Yeah.
To be honest, I haven't tried that. It's a very good question. I've only really used it for the actual forms. I think the lists are still designed within SharePoint Designer. Has anybody else experienced that?
So if you want to create a separate view of the list itself, you would do that using the same views control in SharePoint.
Yeah.
But you can have views of the form and views on the list at the same
Yeah.
time.
So I know if you were to modify the view in SharePoint Designer, then you're basically modifying a list view web part. That's what the view is made up of. So you could still use the data view options for things like conditional formatting and hard win controls using that. But yeah, I think SharePoint Designer is the tool and not InfoPath for the views, if that makes sense. Okay.
And it's just as happy with the managed metadata column as well? In the sort of InfoPath view form?
I would guess so. Again, it's not something that I've tried, but I'm not sure. Your answer. Yeah. Any more questions? Just direct them at the back.
Can you use it in a public anonymous website? InfoPath forms.
Yeah, and the Blue Yonder Airlines is exactly that. So, yeah. So certainly. Mm-hmm.
Can I upgrade my forms that I published in Moss, so they will come over okay in 2010 or?
Yeah, again, that's something I've not tried, but apparently the upgrade story is very good there. So yeah, if you do have existing InfoPath 2007 forms stored inside a form library, then they will open up just fine in InfoPath 2010.
Kind of like pop-up window.
Oh, as far as the list is concerned.
That will just be, I suppose, the SharePoint Designer modified forms and.
Correct. Yeah. I don't know what the story would be with that, to be honest. Yeah.
What about forms from 2003?
As far as opening them up, I would guess again they would open.
And would they republish to SharePoint 2010?
Again, yeah. Once it's actually opened up in InfoPath 2010, I'd imagine you'll be able to submit that back. But yeah, to be tested. I haven't tried it yet. Yeah. I've not tried that with 2010. I did use it for something, whether I was just tinkering. So I think it's just something like the lists.asmx or something along those lines.
I've worked with it. I encountered some problems with the user profile web service. So it asks parameter ID, user ID, and it gives back user ID. So maybe I have a problem there with configuring my InfoPath.
So it's requesting the user ID as a parameter, and then it's not bringing back the data.
He returns the ID that you but is it a configuration thing, or can it
There is. We developed a web part that we had a similar issue with, not directly with a web service, but it was basically when you're filtering on a per user basis, it depends on how you actually formatted that user account as to whether you could sort of use that as part of a condition or not. So it's actually just comparing the string value, the display value, if you like. So I'm not sure if that is possibly a cause, but yeah. Okay, just one more question there.
I think it was a data view web part, the data view is still available in 2010. Can you emulate the same thing in data view with InfoPath forms? The reason I ask is that for a bunch of Mac users who can't use data sheet view because it provides an active X.
Right. I know there are some issues with it at the moment, especially you need to have Microsoft Access installed for the datasheet view to work, and also it's not compatible with a 64-bit browser right now. So there's a
That's why I say, can we use InfoPath forms instead of datasheet view?
I don't see why not if you've got a repeating section. So yeah, you could create a repeating section and manipulate data that way. I'm sure that would work. And then you probably need to look into customizing the ribbon so that you can give your users the option to open it up. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I'd like to thank you all for attending. If you have any other questions, and feel free to come forward. And I guess you've got one more session left after this one. So, all right. Thank you.